Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Coach and Benway podcast. I am your co-host, Dr. Benway. Coach, make yourself known.
Hey, how's it going?
Excellent. It's going well. It's going decently. It's going ecstatically. I tell you why it's going
Jesus, what's that all about? Are you on drugs again?
It's going ecstatically because I am excited for today's episode. So, a few days ago, depending on whether or not that podcast has been released before this one, we had a conversation on villains or people who were determined to be villains in the standard history books of this day and age, who we believe, basically, if you come down to look at them, actually were heroic in their own right. They actually were the true heroes of their age. In that discussion, we thought, well, wouldn't it be fun or wouldn't it make sense to have a corollary episode where we do the opposite, basically take those people who are determined by history of contemporary age to be heroes or heroic, or at the very least, men who make great, the good guys, the great marks on their age, and let's basically take them down a peg, or even more so than that, suggest or argue that they actually were the worst sons of bitches of all.
Yeah. And so we basically came up with 5 names, and the names are Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Churchill, and Martin Luther King. And also, honorary mention will be Obama, but we're going to give Obama a full episode just for him. But I know a lot of people's hair is going to stand on end when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. being not a good guy, but actually a bad guy. And we have our reasons for it. And we have our reasons for FDR and Churchill most especially, whom I personally have come to despise, Woodrow Wilson, and Lincoln, who I'm also come to despise. So, well, let's start off this, let's get the show on the road and start off chronologically. We're going to start off with Lincoln. Benway, what's your, what's the argument for the prosecution here?
Well, I wasn't necessarily going to make it purely from a prosecutorial standpoint, because I'll start off with things I actually do think are interesting about Lincoln. One, I think he is of an interesting tradition in the American Republic, where he was literally a shit-kicking guy who actually did get to the presidency, who actually did have on a modicum, not just a mighty, tiny modicum, an actually significant modicum of talent and intelligence, and was able to articulate himself all the way to the presidency, which is no small feat. Andrew Jackson was somewhat similar, although he came from a little bit better background.
Yeah.
Different perspective, though. What I don't care for, and what I think people really underestimate with Lincoln, and I would say it's almost above and beyond himself, but he's the key part of it. He is the creator of the imperial presidency. There is an argument to be made that if you consider what the American Republic was, what it stood for, the notions of a sort of collective of independent states who, through their own volition, I was going to say conspired, but, collaborated together and compromised to create a sort of loose republic of free states. That died with Lincoln.
Yeah.
And not just the fact that, it's union and not a confederacy. I mean, the imperial presidency was made with Lincoln. The notion that the president basically could step under, certain circumstances, could sweep aside the various brick and mortar checks and balance system that we had built, was set in place. So every time you hear someone say, why is the president executing such powers? How does he get away with that?
Blame Lincoln.
Why is the president able to blame Lincoln?
Blame Lincoln. Yeah. Well, my thinking about Lincoln is that, I grew up with the whole notion that Lincoln was like the hero. I grew up in the 70s when I started learning this history. And for me, Lincoln was the hero. And to tell you the truth, I'd never really paid that much attention to Lincoln, other than this, this goofy-looking guy, with the hat, with a weird hat. What do you call the stovepipe hat or whatever?
Stovepipe hat.
Yeah,
stovepipe.
And so I never really paid attention. As a grown man, I think to myself, man, it must have been something for him to have gone from being, basically Kentucky white trash all the way to the presidency. That's not an easy feat. So the guy obviously had remarkable talents. The fact that he was apparently a master storyteller, a very, very congenial guy, charismatic in intimate settings. That's interesting. That's interesting to me. That would be the case, that he was able to parlay those qualities into political power. But as I've been watching, as you guys know, and Benway certainly knows, I've been watching the Civil War documentary by Ken Burns, endlessly long goddamn thing. But anyway, watching it, and I'm struck by the fact of, first of all, Lincoln's incompetence in prosecuting the war, and which I'm really surprised because he kept picking the wrong goddamn generals to lead the fucking army. Okay, and this excuse that, oh, you know, the best general, Robert E. Lee, went to the South, that's bullshit. There were other capable officers. He just didn't pick them. And he would sit on a bad decision endlessly, like with McClellan, of just not replacing a bad general, not only not replacing him, but then firing him and then bringing him back later. You know, it just seemed ludicrous to me.
I actually kind of disagree with you there, because I actually do think the case that there was a bad crop of generals was realistic, you know, in the North, because the good generals that were in the North had each and every one of them, the two you're going to probably think of, Grant and Sherman, had it was more than just a bad reputation they had. I mean, Grant was a fucking notorious drunk.
Yeah.
During the siege of Vicksburg, he literally was drunk almost every day of the siege because there was nothing to do. And he gets bored. And Tecumseh Sherman was almost a paranoid schizophrenic at some point. Mm-hmm. Like, he really did. He was, I guess at the time you'd say he's prone to the vapors. You know, these are guys who you wouldn't necessarily want to trust with your army. So he's thinking, okay, I've got a bunch of basically retirees that are left with me. And McClellan, for all his purposes, and McClellan, we have to remember, was Lincoln's fucking opponent in his re-election.
Yeah, in the 1864 election, yeah.
At least McClellan actually started training the goddamn soldiers. No one else was doing that.
Yeah.
Even so, I mean, which isn't to say there was, collectively incompetent people on the North. It was just hard to find them for a long point in time. So I don't entirely begrudge him that. What I do kind of begrudge Lincoln is his self-awareness, and he's a guy who is very self-aware in a lot of things. I felt like he was never self-aware enough to know that in creating the mechanisms he needed to prosecute this war, he was going to undermine all of the sort of great liberty of the Republic he thought he was protecting.
Yeah. For all his piousness about the Republic, he seemed very blind to the fact that he was destroying it. It was. I guess that blindness is so egregious that I think that you could easily see it as not blindness at all, but an actual thing that he was doing this maliciously, purposefully, that he was purposefully destroying the Republic under a patina, just an empty talk of the Republic, and we have to save the Republic, blah blah blah. But he was just really a dictator at heart. That's the vibe.
What's interesting on that front is, on a personal level, and I know people say you should keep the personal out of the politics for a large degree, but I think in this case it's warranted. He was a very melancholic man. I mean, he lost. I think he lost almost all of his children except for one. At the end of the day, one I think even died while he was president. I could be wrong.
I think one of them died as president. I forgot. Yeah, it was a tragic life.
So he was constantly. I mean, it wasn't just like, I have a rough life. He was constantly depressed and like melancholia to the extreme. And I think that sort of, and it was like near self-destructive. If you kind of look at the way he lived his life in the White House those last years, it was, barely an existence of respect, not even respectability, just subsistence even. I mean, he was so gaunt. I think he barely ate. He would sleep on the fucking floor at times. God knows what he was doing. And when you have someone that near self-destructive, I won't say he was completely self-destructive, but that near, you're so morose that you can barely just take care of yourself, and his wife not helping the matter either. She was even worse.
She was insane. Yeah.
When you have that mentality, do you I wonder if you just reach the point where, like, I don't give a fuck kind of what I do. Yeah. At a certain extent.
Yeah, I think you do. I think you just throw in the towel and just say fuck it.
Because like in the prosecution of the war, there were a lot of decisions he made directly that was, as I like to say, a case of the fuck it's. So one of the case of the fuckets was when the Supreme Court was constantly hounding him for saying you can't do this, that, or the other for constitutional reasons. I forget if he was, nearly arrested the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or at the very least had him like surveilled and hounded, and basically near threatened him to, stay in line.
Yeah,
that was one piece. There was the suspension of habeas corpus at all, which is to say you have to have some legal excuse to hold anyone. No, he could grab anyone he fucking cared to grab and put him up in the stockade if he so damn pleased.
Yeah, and he would exile people.
Yeah.
Well,
that was my favorite story. I forgot the name of the senator. He was from Ohio, and he was one of the Democrats from Ohio who said, look at the Southern victories in the war. Look at what Lee is doing. We don't have the wherewithal to fight this. There are fellow people, just let them go their own way. He was trying to make that argument right before the 64 election. So Lincoln said, I don't want to deal with this guy. While the guy was campaigning, I think in Ohio or somewhere, Lincoln had some soldiers grab him, escorted him all the way down to the southern border, and just tossed him over the line.
Yeah, actually, I found him. Clement Laird Vallandigham. I've never heard that last name.
But it's such a wonderful American name, I gotta tell you.
Well, British, that's what it is.
Vallandigham, that's Dutch. Well, maybe I'm
wrong. No, I do believe it's British. Vallandigham. Okay. And he was arrested, court-martialed for opposing the war, and exiled to the Confederacy in 1863, according to Wikipedia. Good God. He eventually ran for governor of Ohio in 1863 from exile in Canada, but was defeated. Oh, man. He was a leader of the Copperhead faction of anti-war Democrats.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting world to think back on the Civil War, because the regionalism of the United States, and I use regionalism in scare quotes a bit because there is a concept of regionalism that comes later. It's an attempt to get that feeling back.
Right.
But the idea that there was a New England world, there was a Midwestern world, there was a Southern world, there was a Texas world. Those were real distinct worlds, and you never thought of the United States as a single thing. Right. You saw it as a collection of identities. They were aligned.
It was diverse. It was diverse.
but diverse where it really matters. I mean, it was all essentially white people. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
But outside of the South, which actually had a lot of black people. But their way of life, their thinking, their fundamental ethics, quite different.
Yeah.
Even though they shared, in theory, the Protestant religion, by and large, they still had different interpretations of, what the Bible allowed for and did not allow for. In fact, the Civil War was heavily kind of instigated in part by I don't think it was necessarily the Puritans at the time, but whatever the sort of, extreme Protestant tribes, I'm going to call them tribes, were in the North, particularly the Massachusetts, the abolitionists. Yeah. It was the religious Protestants, and who are really pushing that.
Yeah, you had the Dutch Protestants in Pennsylvania, right, and you had the various British denominations, not just Puritans, who were in New England. Yeah, each one colonized their own colony. Sorry to repeat myself there. They each colonized their own territory. And they made it their own. They stamped it with their own imprimatur. And these various colonies, I mean, that was from the very beginning, from the 1600s, right? And as they continued forward through history over the next 200 years, they developed their own unique, distinct culture. Because we think of the United States today as this homogenous country that you drive everywhere and all the driving rules are the same. The exit signs for the highways are all the same. The highways look all the same. The things by the highways look the same. You got your Taco Bells and your Exxon stations and what have you, right? It feels all so homogenous. Every airport looks the same. Every highway looks the same. Every downtown looks the same. The only thing that changes slightly is the weather. But back at this time, there was real differences, and I personally miss that because, like, traveling around South America, you experience radically different cultures, radically different approaches to the same problems. Everything from radically different approaches to food, for instance, insofar as the cuisine is concerned in different countries, because it's basically the same vegetables, the same animals, but prepared differently, done differently.
And you still
Go ahead.
you still see in America, you still see a little bit of the echoes of the regional distinction, but it's not consistent. Like, for example, I can go from Boston to Atlanta to Austin,
vestiges
to you got to listen to where I'm going with this. From Austin to Phoenix to San Francisco, and it's pretty much the same kind of city.
Yeah.
Different layout for sure, but what you're gonna get and experience outside of some, tinctures of cultural institutions is by and large the same.
Yeah.
It's the same city.
Yeah. Well, look, I've actually driven around the United States. I drove around the whole continent back in 2000, 2001. I was on the road for 6 months, and I saw the whole goddamn continent, Canada and the US, and it's all pretty much the same. And that's kind of depressing. And we could lay the beginnings of this at the feet of Lincoln, because Lincoln created this notion of the one state. Because, you were the one who pointed out that before it was the United States of America are blah, blah, blah. But today it's the United States of America is blah, 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 right? It used to be a collection, and now it's a singularity.
And that came from Shelby Foote. So one of the great pieces of the Ken Burns documentary is it brought forth to public attention in a broader scale the writer Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote was a Southern gentleman writer, a fiction writer for the most part. But during the 60s and 70s, he wrote this monumental 2,000 plus 3-volume history of the Civil War. It's called Civil War: A Narrative. It was, and it was a history of the battles, the people involved with the politics, the big players. It's men and maps, as they used to say about what history was. And it's very much in the tradition of Thucydides and Tacitus and the classical notion of history. He was kind of obscure for a long time until that documentary, and he kind of flourished because he's the most charismatic talking head in that documentary. He's there most of the time.
Yeah.
He has a wonderful drawl to his voice, but he was the one who insisted that, like, look, you fundamentally redrew the country as a result of that. You homogenized it, and and it gave way to kind of what we were going to become, both good and bad. And he respected Lincoln to a certain extent. He thought he was a genius, but he nevertheless did not. And this is what's interesting, to go back and see that documentary and to read his book. He did not play the game that this was purely about, the need to save the Negro. He was very clear. It says that came later in the war. It was kind of
the justification.
to the war.
Yeah, the justification, the post hoc justification for the actions that Lincoln took. Yeah. I mean, it's clear.
Exactly. So
you're looking at Lincoln's presidency, and the things he's doing. First of all, it is unclear why this rebellion, quote unquote, had to be quashed. It's just not really obviously clear. Because if we really are a republic, just a collection of states, then it is unclear why why it should be so incumbent, such an existential crisis for them to remain within the Union. It's not obviously clear, because they're not going to go anywhere. It's not like it's not like boats that can be cast adrift, right? They are territorially always going to be right where they are. So what exactly are you winning except personal power, except centralized power to the coterie around the president? And that's what ultimately we have seen.
And it's funny how people will justify that. It's just like, well, we couldn't have had, if America broke in half, then you would have had the great powers of the world play one bit of America against the other, and that would have ruined the Monroe Doctrine and all of these other things. And I advise people, that is a position which only matters if your perspective is America must become a great power.
Yeah.
And great power, by is a nice way of saying an empire.
Exactly.
Or a global power. So that only really matters if you think that an imperial country is going to happen next and you want it. And in fact, that is what Lincoln gave you. He assured it.
Exactly.
And one of the other, the terrible thing about it's amazing how the Civil War, when you look at it, bears witness to the wars of the 20th century. You see what's going to happen because it was a war where the technology outpaced the tactics. You had near 20th century style technology because of American ingenuity being used on battlefields that were originally designed and executed in 19th and 18th century style warfare, the Napoleonic style of fighting.
Yeah.
And the losses were catastrophic.
Yeah, unbelievable.
And it got to the point where by the end of the war, it became the trench warfare of World War I.
Yeah.
And going even further, after that failed and the South was on its ropes, and in areas like in Missouri, you had guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
Because the Southerners were ready to say, we will fight this war by any means necessary. And Lee told them, don't do that. Ultimately, in which that's why the war ultimately ended. But you had you went from like as a Napoleonic War to World War I to Vietnam style fighting, all within 5 years.
Well, less actually,
or less, exactly, yeah. or less. And so you have to realize that that actually has a catastrophic effect as well. I mean, like think of the cream of the crop who died in that war and the leaders who did not become leaders during what, let's say the 1870s through the 1900s. Remember our great Gilded Age.
You saw that, by the way. You saw the dip in the quality of people who rose to power in the second half of the 19th century. Because it was all the best people died in the Civil War. Yeah.
Yeah, and think of the Gilded Age. Think of what everybody always said about, like corruption run rampant. It's like, well, look who was left to mind the shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's what Lincoln did insofar as quote unquote keeping the Union together. I agree wholeheartedly with your point that the only people who would care about that of keeping the Union together are people who realize that America is going to become an empire and want it to become an empire. If you wanted it to become a series of truly diverse, independent states, as it was before the Civil War, loosely allied, really, but not really. One country in theory, but in practice, everybody ruling their own destiny. In a true democratic republic, if you wanted to turn that into an empire, Lincoln's your guy. If you wanted to have a global empire, Lincoln is your guy. If you wanted true decentralization, then Lincoln is the enemy. And as far as I'm concerned, he's the enemy. He's the bad guy here.
So this is a perfect point. I have two wonderful letters that I would love to read clips of because
please do.
It gets right to the point of especially how people think of what this war means now in contemporary times. You have to think of, at the time, who was on what side. Let me start with the guy who was on Lee's side. Mm-hmm. So one of the great heroes of liberalism, whether the liberalists understand it or not, Lord Acton, the mm-hmm. British Lord, the one who said absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
That axiomatic guy. Funny thing is, people forget a few things about him, especially the atheists who love liberalism. One, he was a strong Catholic, a liberal Catholic, but a Catholic. Two, he was thoroughly and unquestionably on the side of the South in the Civil War. And this is it. He wrote letters to Lee afterwards talking about this situation. And there's a great paragraph in here that I think is wonderful. He starts talking about, when I was looking at Madison and Hamilton's papers on the fathers of the Constitution, so on and so forth, I saw in states' rights the only availing check upon the absolutism of the sovereign will. And secession filled me with hope, not as the destruction, but as the redemption of democracy. The institutions of your republic have not exercised on the old world the salutary and liberating influence which ought to have belonged to them, by reason of those defects and abuses of principles which the Confederate Constitution was expressly and wisely calculated to remedy. And he goes on to this wonderful line after he's singing the praises of the South. Therefore, I deemed that you were fighting the battles for our liberty, our progress, our civilization, and I mourn for the stake which was lost at Richmond more deeply than I rejoice over what was saved at Waterloo.
Oh man, that is very powerful. That's a wholehearted celebration and endorsement of the Confederacy. And a giant fuck you very much to Lincoln and all that happened after.
Absolutely. And here's the other thing that people have to recognize is different from the, and you get it in this perspective. The next perspective will give you the other reading, the other contemporary reading.
Mm-hmm.
But what you see in Acton's reading, which I actually fundamentally believe to be true, even if slavery was a key component of the dialogue of this fight between two ways of life, which I accept it was, here's the reality. It was a fight between and of and about the white people who ran the society. The blacks were incidental.
Oh, yeah.
It was, you were just fucking window dressing. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
It wasn't about you to a certain extent. You were just a piece of the story that we were fighting amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
Different perspective. Now, this was Lincoln's friend. This letter was written to Lincoln. I'm going to read the letter before I tell you who wrote it, but you'll figure it out very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
This was a letter written to Lincoln after his victory in the 64 election.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, we congratulate the American people upon your re-election by large majority. If residence to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery. From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe feel instinctively that the star-spangled banner carried by the destiny of their class, the contest for the territories which opened the dire epopee, I think that must be a typo, were it not decided whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or the prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver. While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborers to sell himself and choose his own master, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in the struggles for emancipation. But this barrier to progress had been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war. The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working class. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of social world. Signed on behalf of the International Working Men's Association.
Queen Victoria?
Written by Karl Marx.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know. It was pretty obvious, after...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But
you see what's at play here.
Yeah.
The fundamental desire to rewrite the entirety of the society, which to be, it's interesting how to read the American Revolution. Some people want to see the American Revolution was very radical. Others want to say it was not very radical. It was actually just Englishmen demanding their rights as Englishmen. But this fundamentally has that attitude, which is now, I think, running rampant in historiography today, which is fundamentally the Marxist reading of the Civil War, that it was the transformation from feudalism into capitalism, which was a superior stage of society, but in so doing, it was allowing the working class the next step on their struggle for progress. And this is how people read it. And I think you should be mindful of who your friends are.
Yeah, the fact that the Marxists embraced the Civil War, it's not surprising. The Marxists have always been enamored of violence. They have always been enamored of historical change that involves great bloodshed. They love, the French Revolution. And the fact of the matter is, what did the French Revolution accomplish? Please tell me. I'd like to know, because they always say that the French Revolution is so important. Who was it? Zhou Enlai said that, we can't tell how the significance of the French Revolution because it was too recent or some shit like that. Faux profound and shit. But actually, what was the significance of it? I think that the American Revolution was much more significant because it gave a template of revolution, of anti-colonial revolution for all of Central and Latin America, and then later on all of the colonies of the great European empires. I mean, the Vietnamese, they self-consciously thought of the American Revolution, not the French Revolution, because of the struggles that occurred during the late 18th and 19th and 20th century were all anti-colonial, not anti-monarchical. Okay, but anyway, look, About
Well, it was interesting.
go,
Sorry, go ahead.
no. I was just going to round it back to Lincoln, whom I really kind of like. I despise him, to tell you the truth. The more I get to understand him, the more I despise him. You know, the more I look at him as just a man who lost complete sight of what he was supposed to be doing. And do I think that he was doing it out of personal aggrandizement? No. But I think that his moral compass was thrown askew, perhaps by the tragedies that befell his personal life, the death of his children and what have you, and the insanity of his wife. Perhaps that was the reason. But for whatever reason, I mean, you can only speculate as to reasons, but it seems to me that the more I look at Lincoln, the more I see a man who lost his moral compass and engaged in a horrifically bloody civil war that was, in a very real sense, unnecessary, and that its justifications, I find, its moral justifications were post hoc, and I find them disingenuous because they didn't give a shit about the black slaves. What they cared about, especially in the North, was the cheap labor that could compete with the white laborers, and they didn't want that. And they wanted access to cheap labor too, and the idea of freed slaves. It would be cheaper for them. You know, I just find it just really despicable how it was turned into a moral crusade. Am I saying that slavery is a good thing, then they should have kept on with slavery? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that don't dress up your drive to ambition with these great moral pledges. That's just so much bullshit. That's my position on this issue. And insofar as Lincoln, he just prosecuted the war in an incompetent way that was needlessly bloody. And I think that needless bloodshed not only killed off the best people that would have led the American states into the future in the next few decades, but I do believe that the social unrest that we saw in the 1960s was directly a result of the death throes of what happened in the Civil War. I think that J.D. Unwin writes about how 100 years after a great demographic cataclysm, you have the effects of it usually, and we have seen this. We saw in the 1960s the social unrest that you could trace to the Civil War. We see today in Europe the collapse of European will as they are allowing themselves to be invaded by third worlders after the catastrophe of the First World War, which happened exactly 100 years before. It seems that J.D. Unwin was dead right on these issues. Now, insofar as Lincoln, why this drive to power at such tremendous cost? Anybody sane would have said no. Anybody sane, after a few of these bloody battles, would have said, you know something, the cost is too high, and would have said no. You know what I'm saying?
I think by the end of it, he became an agent of history. By that I mean he no longer was operating or maneuvering just simply for the sake of I'm an individual here making decisions that will shape the world. I am functioning almost as the necessary gear in a flow of history, which was was coming along since the fall of the
in the grips of historical inertia. You mean?
Or not no, it's the opposite of inertia. It was almost like a tidal wave of which he was just allowed himself to be the conduit to carry it to the next level, which was the increasing consolidation of and centralization of power. He was a functional cog to that chain which started since the killing of the king in the French Revolution, which is, from my point of view, the fundamental reason why the French Revolution was important. There's sociological and psychological reasons I say that. But from that, the notion that the king is just a manifestation of God, or the God's will, to a notion that the state decides the will of the world order, and to do so requires an immense accumulation of power and capability beyond which even the greatest of emperors could manage. That was what was happening since those revolutions, and Lincoln was as I said, the force in this country to allow it to grow.
Okay, so
which
let's
is
move
why.
on to our next guy. Our next guy is Woodrow Wilson. Now, I'm semi familiar with him, but I think that you're more familiar. So why don't you give the précis for this guy, and we can discuss him.
Well, I mean, it's to the extent to which people hate him now. It's because he was a Southern gentleman who didn't like black people. But that's to me, incidental. The the thing that Wilson is known for now, is his notion of what a liberal or world order should be like. So, if those of you who might remember your history books, before he was the president before world American entry into World War One, and he eventually brought us into World War One, despite the fact that during his election he says, "I will not, shed one American life for this war." Blah 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 blah.
Bullshit,
He lied.
bullshit, bullshit. Yeah.
Lied on that one. But
Kill
here's the thing: at
surprise.
the end of that, after the war, he was the guy instrumental in developing the League of Nations. The notion that I am going to decide, or we're going to have like a collection of states which will collectively decide all the problems in the world, and we'll never have war again. We'll all live happily ever after. But little did you know that the mechanisms to make that, the decide, like I'm going to take a little piece of this country, a little piece of that country, and put it over here, and I'm going to make this new country over here, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. If you look at the output, that shit sandwich that they made, be it not just in Europe, but in the Middle East and all over the places of the world.
Sykes-Picot, all the rest of it, yeah?
They sowed the seeds to ensure that World War II would be, World War I phase two, which to a certain extent I always kind of feel it's, yes, it has its own thing, but it's really
the second 30 years war, yeah. Yeah. It was the second 30 years war. There's no real other way to look at it. It was just, one big war with a truce in the middle of it. Yeah, because the causes were basically the same. An inability of France and England to acknowledge the burgeoning German statehood, and an unwillingness to acknowledge that this state of disparate little principalities had finally gotten its shit together and unified. And the Bismarckian state, it was not just Bismarck, it was going to be a going concern. And they were never able to acknowledge that very simple fact. I never quite understood it, because to me, both world wars were pointless and needless. There was no real need for it. And well, like I said earlier in this very conversation, the effects of the First World War, we're seeing them now. And I don't even want to think of what it's going to look like in the years like 2040, 2050. I think that's when Europe is going to just vanish, and it will be overrun by these because I truly do believe that the second 30 years war, the war from 1914 to 1945, was essentially Europe committing suicide, collective suicide. And even though there was the post-war boom and all the rest of it, we are seeing the decay of Europe now, these soy boy faggots, because that's what they are, and the collapse of Europe. Because Europe, I live in Europe. I am telling you, they are all a bunch of faggots. I've lived in Paris. I've lived in Germany. I've lived in London. They are faggots with no will. They don't have any kind of moral confidence. They don't have any kind of national confidence. They are the children of the cowards and weaklings who survived the First and Second World Wars because they weren't called up to go to battle. It's as simple as that. Because who died in the First World War and the Second World War? The best and the brightest. Who survived? The weaklings and the cowards. And so it was the weaklings and the cowards who had more children. Yeah, and there were the good burghers who made lots of money. But, their progeny, who are they? Weaklings. They're zeros. I see them. They are pathetic. That's why you can take their women whenever you feel like it, and they're not going to do a goddamn thing because they're weak. Ugh. I just so despise the Europeans, to tell you the truth. Sorry for the rant.
So back to Woodrow Wilson. But here's the thing: the seeds of globalism that everybody is particularly, or in our side, agitated over was begun to be sown by Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of the details came out after World War II, but after World War II, it's like we're going to take Wilson's
do-over.
and give it a second. I'll give it a do-over. Exactly. There's a corollary between almost every piece of Woodrow Wilson's plan. to what happened after World War II. The most obvious being League of Nations turned into the United.
Yeah.
The central piece of that. But the idea that, was this. He said, all nations fundamentally want to live according to liberal principles.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is another way of saying, which is, you could see that funnel its way through to Vietnam. Again, one of my favorite lines in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket was when I think it was the colonel or the general is talking to Joker.
Yeah, it's a colonel. Yeah. What was the line?
Inside every gook body is an American wanting to break out.
Struggling to break out. Struggling to break out. That was a great line, actually. Yeah. I mean, well, I have my opinion about the movie. Lots of great individual scenes, but it didn't really come together. But that was a great line. Yeah. But no, insofar as Woodrow Wilson is concerned, this arrogance of thinking that his vision of how people want to live is how they are going to live, and he is going to impose it on them, whether they like it or not, for their best interests. Fuck that. I mean, as a decentralist, which is what I am, as a person who truly believes that each people should live the life that they want to and not be hassled, and whatever economic system or political system they want to have, let them. It's their business. Yeah, he's a guy that I despise because he thought that the only good kind of democracy was the liberal, capitalistic democracy of the United States. That not even the United States, the kind of democracy that he wanted in the United States, and that he struggled awfully hard to implement. And I don't see. A lot of people despise him because he was a racist. I don't care about that part. I care about the fact that he was an imperialist trying to impose a vision of the world on everybody else that was perhaps good for him, but not for the rest of the world. So what the fuck? Why are you doing this? Yeah. Ugh.
Well, there's a great detail about all of this that I think people tend to forget. Sometimes they remember it from their high school history books, but I don't even think that's taught anymore. Wilson failed to convince his fellow Americans that this plan was worth it. People forget that when he came back from saying, "Oh, look at the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, everything's wonderful," the American Congress, spurred on by the conservative Republicans, said, "Fuck this. Yeah. We're not part of a global organization. We're not going to participate." And it stressed him out so much that Woodrow Wilson had a stroke and died before his presidency was over.
Oh, boo-hoo. Break out the Kleenex, Okay, well, anyway, Woodrow Wilson, we're actually running kind of late, so let's skip ahead to FDR. Oh, yes, FDR, another hero, quote unquote, who is a fuckhead. I hate him, I hate him because he was a socialist. He was power hungry. He was a man who would throw anybody under the bus and any institution under the bus for his own power. I get the feeling that he jerked off every night knowing that he was going to go into World War II, okay? I mean, there's a guy that I've come to despise because everybody says that he was such a great person, but what he actually did, it seems to me, is that he created this notion that you can depend on daddy government. And that just took away agency and individual power from the people. Because you can only feel powerful if you overcome a true adversity. You individually, as a man, you can only feel powerful when you are really skirting the edges of the cliff and manage to pull yourself away from that edge of the cliff and manage to make a life for yourself. Now, Social Security, all this stuff of helping older people, all this, it sounds all good and fine. Oh, it's the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, to help the elderly, to help the poor, blah, blah. Well, yeah, on the one hand, it sounds like such a good thing, but in the end, it creates an unhealthy dependence. It's like a drug. And all drugs, all dependencies ultimately corrode and destroy the person. Okay? I mean, if you depend on somebody else to give you money, you eventually wind up depending on that person and you wind up not trying very hard because you have somebody who can support you, and it's catastrophic, it seems to me. And it seems that the welfare state started with FDR. The welfare state and the gargantuan U.S. bureaucracy to manage the welfare state, and it made Americans a lesser people. He made Americans a lesser people. That's my thinking.
Well, I'll tell you, I disagree with you slightly. But for the most
Oh,
part,
you think he was just a flat out commie and not just a socialist?
No, the opposite. The opposite. The opposite. I actually think he wasn't even a socialist. He was something more nefarious.
Oh,
Because we're kind of loose with our notions of what socialism means. I take socialism just to mean effectively the quote unquote people fundamentally owning and operating all of the various means of production.
right. Yeah.
He didn't really believe in that.
Didn't.
What he believed was in management and order of the system, because you have to remember at the time he operated on the assumption that in order to save capitalism, capitalism needs to control everything. By that, I mean, the government, the bureaucracy you had, he absolutely believed, like, yeah, we'll have all these welfare programs. We'll tell people what they can do and not do. We're going to have various stimulus programs to the economy. We'll direct a lot of things. But who was it all fundamentally in charge? It was still the bureaucrats. It was still, basically the class of which Roosevelt himself was a constituency of. But he just gave that class immensely more power than ever had. What I would suggest he was one of the early starters of, I'm going to use some Marxist terminology here, forgive me, of the Fordist state. Ford is almost referencing Ford of the production line, which is the idea that the state and capital worked in unison to manage the entirety of society, and everything was a well-oiled machine. Everything was very structured. This basically was the modus operandi for America through the 70s.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the collapse under the Carter regime and the transition to Reagan that you moved toward neoliberalism. But that was
it seems to me that the collapse started when Belleau Wood's regime could no longer be sustained and Nixon had to get off the gold standard. Yeah, but your point is well taken. I see your point. Well, for the same reason. I mean, I think that the guy was evil. I think that the man, instead of doing what he should have done, which is we look at Hitler as this evil villain, and we talk the Holocaust and all the rest of it. First of all, we never stopped to acknowledge that the Holocaust happened because of the food blockade, and the Germans realized that they were not going to have enough food to feed all their people, so they would have to get rid of some of the people that they had under their thumb, and they realized who are the people that they should get rid of? Shit, the Jews, Polish Catholics, and Russian prisoners of war. Because, there isn't going to be enough food to feed everybody, so we got to get rid of some of these people, so we might as well just be efficient about it as opposed to allowing them to starve to death. That was their rationale. And we look at that as Hitler. Hitler was evil. Well, before 1942, when this genocidal program started, in 1938 and 39, okay, especially during the phony war, the so-called Sitzkrieg, when everybody had declared war against one another, but the war really hadn't broken out, what's his name? FDR had the golden opportunity, because there was no state of war with Nazi Germany, a golden opportunity to negotiate a true peace, negotiate a way out of the oncoming war. And FDR was the only person who could have done this, because the Nazis did not have a problem with the Americans. The Nazis, they had actually very strong relationships, and there were a lot of pro-Nazis in the United States. Now, of course, you say pro-Nazi and it sounds like fucking skinheads and shit like that. Well, you had people like Charles Lindbergh, right? You had a lot of people who saw no reason, realistically, no reason for another war with Germany in 1939. And FDR, instead of doing the diplomatically smart thing, he allowed himself to be pushed into a war. I don't know if he allowed himself to be pushed into war or actually he just wanted it. My personal suspicion is that he wanted it. He loved his Navy battleships and shit like that. He loved all that militaristic shit, especially from somebody who's actually never served. Because he was the Undersecretary of the Navy, but he never served. He was never in combat. He never got shot at. Okay? So he looked at it as a very distant thing. The aristocrat like playing at war instead of actually fighting a war. The people who have actually been to war. Have you noticed that the men who have led the great powers in the last century, who have actually been at war, have almost never gone to war. And if they do, like George H.W., who is the only one I can think of offhand, they make sure that it's quick, clear, in and out, nothing prolonged. All the other people, they never served, they never got shot at, And so they think it's just like a casual thing, that it's just going to be, like a sporting event or some shit like that. Ugh. I hate
To me,
FDR.
the best for FDR, the good comparison in my mind is to his cousin, Teddy. Teddy actually fought in a war. He was the head of the Rough Riders. But and he did. He always say about his big stick diplomacy, whatnot. But he fundamentally, if you really look at him, was fairly contained in what he did. But the other thing you have to also keep in mind is Teddy Roosevelt still operated as a man's man. He looked upon his father, who paid for someone to take his place in the American Civil War, and was so disgusted with that he vowed that he would never, or he would basically through his own life he would make amends for such a dishonor. And he actually fought in the war, and then when he came to his own prominence in the United States, had that experience to make his own decisions.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that he. I have not read Teddy Roosevelt's biography. I did not know that was like a big thing in his life. It would certainly be a big thing in my own life if that had been the case.
Yeah, precisely. But FDR was basically the different wing of the family, and was sort of like, imagine like how Katharine Hepburn's family would have been. That New England kind of charm,
inbred losers. Yeah.
Well, he literally did marry his cousin.
Yes, he did, didn't he? And all those children, how did they come out? Well or badly? I'm saying badly. You? Anybody want to argue?
Did he? I forgot. Did he spawn? I don't know.
Yes, he did. And they were all just losers. They were nobodies. They were like these inconsequential people that filled the middle echelons of the upper classes of the government, And they all sucked at the government tit. Horrible people.
Well, that was the other thing you had mentioned. Did he want to go to war? I think he did. He was certainly very friendly with Churchill before Americans decided.
Yeah, because like a lot of these American aristocrats, he was fundamentally socially insecure when it came to the British. That's something I always find so goddamn amusing. The upscale Americans, they always feel like déclassés when compared to the Brits, especially to British aristocrats. I just find that just wildly amusing. But that's for a different conversation. But yeah, he loved his Churchill, and they got along famously. Yeah, Churchill is the next warmonger piece of shit we're going to talk about. But go ahead.
Well, let's get into Churchill then, if you wish.
I hate Churchill because I think that Pat Buchanan was right on the money. I haven't read his book yet, Pat Buchanan's book yet. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that Churchill was just a warmonger, and he just wanted a war. He just wanted a war and didn't give a shit about what it cost. Another little fucking loser who thought that playing at war was the gentlemanly thing to do. Although I do believe that he actually did fight in a war, which would make him a psychopath.
He fought in the Boer War, which was the first war that signs where trouble was brewing for the British Empire. He actually was captured, and I think he escaped from a concentration camp as well. Yeah. That was another thing that happened. There were actually concentration camps.
Yeah, they were created by the Brits.
They were exactly. But there was that, and yeah, he had certainly a chip on his shoulder. He was the ultimate British imperialist to a certain point. My take on Churchill is more complicated. I'm a little bit indifferent to him. By that I mean I have things I think are interesting about him and other things I hate about him. Mm-hmm. I do fundamentally respect the idea of basically if you look at Britain in the 30s, it wasn't necessarily a basket case, but it was a listless, rudderless country that had no belief in itself or anything, frankly.
Yeah. Gosford Park is a really accurate representation of that period. It's a really interesting picture.
A really great movie.
Yeah, it is a brilliant movie. The only fly in the ointment is Stephen Fry's character. They should have played it serious instead of buffoonish, and it would have been a brilliant movie. I mean, it would have been a classic. I think that sort of like spoiled the movie somehow. But anyway, you were saying?
But anyway, yes. So there's something to be said about the face of the strength of the empire, saying, especially if you're convinced, which we can argue about in a second, if you think that your country is fundamentally at an existential threat, and remember, what's his face, Churchill's predecessor.
No, I want to see Clement Attlee.
Why don't we? I know. I was saying, well, why did I get, Chamberlain? We always say the never Chamberlain Munich moment.
Yeah.
Chamberlain had already decided that war against Germany was going to happen, and Churchill just took the reins. There is something to be said about a guy who, if you believe your nation is in an existential threat, says, we're going to fucking fight, and we're not going to, and if we're going to fucking die, we'll all die on this island, and we're not going to surrender. I appreciate that. But on the other hand, the question of his, what were you fighting for and what did you leave behind was spurious. I'll take, for example, I'm a Polak, as everybody knows. So my notion as to like whether, was Hitler really going to expand or not? I mean, I adopt the idea he was going to take whatever the fuck he wanted, and he demonstrated he did. So by the time, you guys are arguing whether or not you're fighting in the war, it's indifferent to my fucking people. We were already fighting it. The notion, though, that I hate about Churchill is that after the war, the whole point about saying we fought for Poland, and then it comes to the Soviet Union in control of everything, and Stalin basically says, I'm taking this, and Churchill says, yeah, that sounds fine.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's such a, pussy. And there are other things people hate about Churchill that I don't mind at all, is his notion that, like, Mr. Gandhi's fucking up India. India, never had it so good with, before we got there. Like, part of me viciously says, yeah, he's probably right.
Oh, yeah, he's right about that. Yeah. Yeah, no, he's right about that.
And then afterwards, and he actually was, even though he failed about it, he said, if we're going to, we cannot allow all of the Commonwealth constituents to come into Britain, and, it will actually destroy the nation. He even contemplated the idea that, like, maybe we should have a campaign slogan that says, keep Britain white. He was dead serious about it.
Yeah.
It never happened.
Yeah, it never happened, but I think he was absolutely right. He agreed with Enoch Powell, in essence. But look, I think that Churchill, I can view things, look, I don't view him as a demon, okay? What I'm saying is that in the major decisions that he was a party to, he was a disaster. He was First Lord of the Admiralty during the disaster at Scapa Flow. He was, in the war, in the First World War, and he was also a disaster, He was...
The Dardanelles,
Yeah. I forget the specifics of it. Because
Gallipoli and all of that shit. So it's a Mel Gibson movie.
He has failed upward. He failed upward. Okay, and finally because he was always considered the golden boy, right? And finally, like Boris Johnson. That's why I despise Boris Johnson, because I know those guys. I know those aristocratic guys who are full of promise, who are so handsome, and there are blonde locks and blue eyes, and everybody thinks that they're adorable and wonderful, and they're so brilliant, and they can, suck up to the right teachers and come across as so fucking brilliant, right? And at the end of the day, when they actually achieve power, they make a complete hash of it, because they have never really struggled. They have never really fought to have anything. It's always been given to them, okay? Based on this promise that they will one day be great. But in the end, they are never great. They usually fuck things up. And as far as I'm concerned, I look at Churchill, and he fucked things up. He fucked things up royally. He fucked things up insofar as World War I. He fucked things up when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. He fucked things up as Prime Minister. What should he have done when the phony war broke out? He should have sued for peace. After the whole disaster at Dunkirk, where it was obvious that the Nazis were not bombing the British Empire into bits and pieces because they didn't want to really go to war with London, with British, and they wanted to somehow figure out a way to get some peace, right? Because that's the only reason. Okay, it was a clear sign, and I think it was a stupid sign, because a fundamental misreading. Because I think that Adolf Hitler thought to himself, the Brits are self-aware enough and aware enough of their own best interests that they're going to realize that the only move for them is to sue for peace. So I'm not going to wipe out their army, because, what would be the point of that? And I think that Hitler, fundamentally misread Churchill. He didn't realize that Churchill was a psychopath. That's what I think. I think that he was just a guy who just wanted war, just wanted to kill people. And it's as simple as that. I don't see his decisions as rational, because he threw away the British Empire for what? I mean, what was gained? That's the issue. What was the champagne room going to look like for Britain by pursuing this war with Hitler? And bullshit that it was for freedom and the people and that he was on the side of the angels. when you go to war for a practical reason. What was the practical reason to go to war with Hitler? None. There was no practical reason. There was nothing to be gained and everything to be lost, and it was lost. The British lost everything. The British became a nothing country by 1948. Look at it. Look at everything that the British had. They lost because of going to war with Germany for no, and they, on top of that, they lost their best people. For what? Okay. Oh.
So I don't know that I necessarily think of Churchill exclusively as just a psychopath, but I'll say this. I think Britain was probably lost before that. I think all of the people in his Conservative Party, especially ironically enough, the ones suing for peace, were not masculine, manly men. They did not really believe in anything. They just wanted to avoid issue. And I don't think that's any more respectable. The problem with Britain is, especially when you look at when the decay in Britain starts, starting about when Britain really starts sliding out of the deep end. It's around the mid-60s, in particular when Harold Wilson's government forms. Churchill dies actually in 65, and people have noted, I think even Peter Hitchens has noted, that death marks the end point of that older era, where even like it was flailing before that, but the notion that like the last vestiges of it are gone. The notion that and this is what I hold against Churchill and everybody of his generation. They could not preserve what they fought to defend.
No.
Whether you believe they fought correctly or incorrectly is almost a side point. They, at least in their rhetoric, had tasked themselves with preserving their nation.
Yeah.
The nation did not last as it is through that point in time. Going into the 60s through today, the Britain of today is very much a remnant, the after effects, the dying ember of what Churchill left behind. And I think there's even some direct human physical manifestation of that, which is the Queen herself. The Queen's first prime minister was Winston Churchill. She's like one of the very few people on earth who has a living connection to the old empire like that.
Yeah.
And he gave her, and she acknowledged, to the extent she can acknowledge it, has sort of acknowledged it, and people around her have acknowledged it, that her notions of how to act as the Queen came from him. And she has not acted like a particularly great queen. She's just a presider over the mess.
Yes, the presider in chief. Yes. Yeah. Well, okay. So. Okay. So the next one after Churchill and FDR. Oh, MLK. We don't think highly of Martin Luther King. We think that everything who thinks he's a hero is a fool. We think that he's sort of like a villain. Now, this is going to be a tougher one to sell, so let's see how we sell it.
So here's my take on that. You can say anything you like about his desire to have people who get along. Let's give you the most generous, simplistic reading of him, which is to say, look, I just want my people to get along as equally as anybody else. We're all part of the same, crop. We're all going to live together happily and whatnot and go to the promised land, all that jazz. The problem with that is to simply look at the society we live in now, to look at the differences and race and ethnicity, what have you. Look at how people articulate themselves about it. Look at the rage that multiculturalism has brought. Whether he thought he was a good guy or not, he manifested the idea that nothing about you matters. He says about the content of your character, not by the color of your skin, but he fails to realize the content of your character is a product of the people who you are. And by, giving this gloss, whether it's his intent or not, he gave, similar to how, this is the reason I mentioned Lincoln and I mentioned FDR, it's all part of the same thread to me. These guys gave the gloss of moral acceptability and almost like an indulgence, a self-indulgence from the American North, the American empire, the American capitalistic project, to simply say, look at this good thing we've done. We have the great moral courage. Everything I do to treat you and turn you into a cog in a machine, the idea that you are no different from any other piece of shit I can grab up and fill in the gears and make my money, the fact that he gave that gloss, which has been used to deny any criticism of the state, makes him one of the worst perpetrators of a crime against humanity to a certain extent, because he gave them that respectability.
I'm processing. I'm trying to see.
Think of it this way: who loves Martin Luther King? Who is, of all of the civil rights leaders, right? Of all of those protesters,
Right?
who gets the break? Who gets the holiday? Who gets the, when they're, when Apple does their commercial, Gandhi, Malcolm Luther King, Steve Jobs, kind of thing. The idea, like, look, we're all one, and and it's all like one happy race. We're all together, and we have a diversity officer here, and all of this ideology that we've accumulated.
Right.
Who's the guy who they put on and said, like,
MLK, sure.
MLK. So think about Jordan Peterson when someone brought in an interview not too long ago, when I think it was an interview with some Canadian newspaper. I don't give a shit. And they were asking him, is like, do you think, that court case in America recently, that the idea that if you're a religious bakery, are you obliged to bake the cake for a gay couple? And Jordan said, no, I don't think they should. That's an imposition. And then the Canadian gave a really, the standard tactic that the left will give, which is, well, Malcolm Luther King, forced people to serve black people, and isn't that all right? And Jordan Peterson, because he drank that Kool-Aid so much, because he hates identity politics, said, yeah, I guess it's right that they should have been, imposed. And like, frankly, no, they shouldn't. I am very adamant about that. No, that was an assumption that the state had the power to define and orchestrate and nurture the morality of the society above and beyond just like making sure that we're functioning here. No, it's like we're radically rewriting all of your codes, and there are thought crimes now as a result of this.
So you're basically saying that Martin Luther King was not the originator of the notion of the state policing morality, but one of the prime movers of that ideology, and the godfather of the current state of affairs that we have today, where we have hate crimes and hate speech and bullshit like that, or basically questioning the morality, the intentions of people, and then making those intentions, those moral intentions, legally actionable. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, all your moral attitudes, and above and beyond, like I said, above and beyond just basic functioning, we allowed them to become not even just public assets of the state, but public assets of just private companies and everything. All of the fucking companies can now use Martin Luther King as the exegesis to say, we're going to have these rules about who can and cannot be hired, and again, those rules about those who can and cannot be hired. Martin Luther King is this sort of gloss that gives them protection, because they said, look at this meek and mild man. He was asking very just simple, polite things. Who could blame him? I mean, who would ever want to fight against this? It's nefarious. This is the notion of things. And this is why, ironically enough, I actually...
let me ask you something. I've actually never studied the notion of free association, the right to free association and the restrictions on it. When did the restrictions start on it? Before Martin Luther King, I would assume. Because, I mean, the right to serve or not serve somebody is an issue of free association, right? So when would that have started?
It's all tied to the, I forget the numbers of my amendments to my Constitution. I apologize. I think that is the 14th Amendment, basically, that, you can't judge someone based on their, race or whatever by law. Well, the 14th Amendment is fundamentally the underlying principle behind these decisions. So, it's the aftermath of the Civil War decide, the state has assumed the role. It's effectively, the state has assumed the role of the church.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And, it's a state, in a way, in a twisted way, it is a state religion. The state religion has decided on this authority, and, the 14th Amendment encapsulating that. And as a result, Martin Luther King's impositions on private companies to basically say, no, you have the obligation to treat me as a man, as opposed to a God, demand that you do it, which is different from the state. Even the great thinkers of the Catholic Church understood that difference. Because of that, the 14th Amendment was then applied, and it transformed itself into the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act, which is another manifestation of that. The Civil Rights Act is justified constitutionally in part because of the 14th Amendment. Again, if I picked the wrong number, I apologize. You know what I'm talking about. This is why I actually respect Malcolm X more. Malcolm X's position was, we blacks have an obligation to build our own society impeded. I don't necessarily need you, the white man, to take me into your home and love me and kiss me and squeeze me. I just simply demand that you leave me the fuck alone.
Yeah.
Which I respect a lot more.
Yeah, so do I. There was a sense that I'm not being very articulate insofar as this issue of MLK and Malcolm X is concerned. I look with fonder eyes on Malcolm X. He seemed like, first of all, a more interesting man. And secondly, he seemed more interested in actually helping black people as opposed to inserting black people into white society. Because before the Civil Rights Movement, before 1955, the United States really was an apartheid state. There were two United States, the black United States and the white United States. And they, crossed paths here and there, but for the most part, they were separate. Separate but equal, perhaps, or perhaps not, as the case may be, but they were separate. And it seemed to me that Malcolm X wanted to continue that idea of a separate Black America.
I'll phrase it. Go
ahead.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I was saying a good way of phrasing it would be that Malcolm wanted emancipation. Malcolm wanted integration.
Wait, you said Malcolm twice.
Oh, sorry. Malcolm wanted emancipation. Martin wanted integration.
Yeah.
Martin wanted to be like, I want to be, I just want to be almost like a drop of paint mixed into the can, and you cannot distinguish me from right to left. Whereas Malcolm said, I want to be free, my people to be free.
Yeah, but there was something else, too, that Malcolm seemed to be preaching a vision of the black man as strong and independent, black power, black is beautiful. Whereas Martin Luther King seemed to be essentially opening the door to what we have now, which is this black underclass that is beholden to the government. That's sort of like the stepchild that everybody has to support,
It's partly tied to the religious question. Both of these men were religious. Malcolm was an Islamist, or not Islamist, that's unfair. Muslim. He was a Muslim. And Martin was Christian, Protestant, unfortunately, but there you go. Martin adopted what Nietzsche would probably understood well as the Christian slave morality, which actually has political power, which is to say, because my goodness is defined by my weakness.
Yeah.
Because I am the victim, in my victimness, I bear the Lamb of God, and my life is justified above you, the people who have the whip over me. Yeah. And that's a very convincing thing. You can wound people like that around you, and you get power from your victimhood that way. That was his approach. Malcolm was, and his relationship with Islam was very complicated because it came later, and I don't know how much it was as big a thing. His whole thing was more around the idea that, like, I am the problems in my life as a black man is the degree to which I am still entangled in the system that white people create, which is to their own benefit. So he naturally will say whites are the great Satan, they're the awful people, but it's in part because, I can't live my own life in America because they it's like every time I think I'm out, they want to pull me back in. They have their restrictions on me. They have notions of where I can and can't live, what kind of places I can and can't buy, and I just want to define it by myself. So it's, in some sense, he wants further disentanglement between the two groups. And the funny thing was, the American Nazis, what was it? Rockwell, I think his name was.
Rockwell.
And and the Nation of Islam, I think Malcolm as well, had either like a public meeting or some sort of meeting where they had some degree of mutual understanding, like legitimate mutual understanding of each other.
Yeah.
They understood that they comprehended the notion the exact same way.
Yeah, they just wanted to be alone. Yeah. That's temperamentally always been my thing. I just want to be left alone. I don't want to be interfered by other people, especially busybodies. I just want to be living my life and just leave me the fuck alone. But I think that about MLK circling back to him, I think that was you're pretty much nailing it on the head with the Nietzsche argument of the slave mentality. Because it was always the government controlled by the white man. White man, please help me, the poor little black man, and change your laws so that I get some benefit out of it. And I think that ties back in very neatly to the notion of the previous people we were talking about, of Lincoln and FDR and Woodrow Wilson, all of them trying to use power to control other people, either directly, like Woodrow Wilson, or more nefariously, like FDR, of making them dependent. And FDR just continued that. And he inflicted this notion on Black America, especially Black American women. Because now Black American women, they don't need Black American men. So what do the men do? They just fucking run, They leave a lot of spawns behind, and they don't care about any kind of responsibility. It's been catastrophic for the Black American family. And it was predicted. That's the thing that I always find so amusing. All of these social disasters were predicted by sensible people. And what happened to these sensible people? They were all called racists. God damn, man. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. So that's MLK. And that leads us with Obama. We're going to do a full episode on Obama. So what do you want to say are the highlights of Obama, who everybody claims is a hero, but we think is a villain?
Well, to me, if I keep on this particular thread, because when we were coming up with this list, I intentionally tried to order it and suggest things to create a cohesive whole, because I do think from Lincoln through MLK, not only the fact that MLK was at Lincoln's memorial during his great speech, all of those guys in between were part of this movement in history. And Obama takes it to the next level. I'll tell you my notion of the biggest failure or the biggest evil of Obama to a certain extent, though you can interpret it different ways, and we'll talk about that when we get to that episode, is the race relations that came about in the United States as a result, directly, I would argue, of his policies and his rhetoric. Think about from the very early days of Obama's presidency, when that professor from Harvard, I think, was, I forgot the name of the professor, but remember the cops came to his house because I guess he was locked out of his house and people didn't recognize him. They thought he was a guy trying to break in. And then Obama had I want to have a beer with these cops and tell them what it's like to be a black man. It's like, fuck you. Escalating to the Zimmerman shooting of what's his face in Florida.
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin. He looks like he could be my son.
My gangbanging son who I've disowned. Yeah, okay.
and then the explosion into Ferguson and everything from that. To me, that is the capstone of the failure of his presidency. The notion that there was a kind of peace made between the various groups in this country, and after him, the cat just went out of the fucking bag. Now, part of me says, well, if you're a ethno-nationalist, as some of our listeners may be, you would say, good, he finally broke the fucking peace that was, constricting our dialogue. Now we can say whatever the fuck we want. But there was a stability that he destroyed, I think, perhaps intentionally.
My thinking on Obama is that on just about every level, he was a disaster. Insofar as foreign policy, he just made a hash of everything. He created the chaos that is Libya, that has directly impacted Europe catastrophically. Because Libya, as Gaddafi himself said, Libya was the cork in the African bottle, and he wiped that out. And look what we have. Libya. There was the hash of Syria, where he basically played not just both sides against the middle, but all sides, just arming everybody until all the factions that the CIA was arming were fighting one another and the Syrian government for no reason, clearly. Just an emphasis on creating chaos for the sake of chaos, without any kind of overarching ideal of where you want to have foreign policy go. Then, insofar as domestic policy, the ballooning of the federal government debt, rather, it doubled in his time. It went from roughly $9 trillion to $18 trillion, and it became a bigger chunk so far as servicing the debt is concerned. It became a huge chunk of federal government expenditures, and that level of debt servicing can only be maintained in a low interest environment. The day the interest rates have to be raised in order to halt inflation is going to be a catastrophic day for the American government, because then it's just, game over. This game only works when you have a low interest environment. And Obama was lucky enough that the Federal Reserve had to continue with the low interest and zero interest environment, really. Because of the failure of the American economy to pick up after the 2008 financial crisis. Then you have civil rights. I mean, Obama assassinated U.S. citizens, deliberately so, and he okayed it. And he personally oversaw drone strikes against individuals and family members and suspected terrorists who may or may not have been terrorists. Basically extrajudicial killings. That's assassinations. I think that's just immoral on the one hand, and on the other, it just proves that the guy was just a bloodthirsty faggot, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, somebody, yuck, Look, I don't begrudge the guy that he is actually a homosexual, and he's going to be coming out in whenever it's politically convenient for him. I don't begrudge him that, okay? But what I do begrudge him is that his faggoty attitude towards so many important aspects in life, in foreign policy, and everything that you mentioned insofar as race relations. Yeah, totally agree. You're on the money insofar as your analysis. He was a catastrophic president, and more to the point, he, in a very real sense, lied to his own people, to the Democrats, pretending to be one thing when he was really just a corporatist. He was in the pockets of the Clintonistas, who are just corporate shills, each and every one of them, beholden to corporate interests, right? The Democrats, the Clinton Democrats, which have dominated the party since 1994, really, the Clinton Democrats are corporate shills, and they sell themselves to corporations. They are much more than the Republicans, because the Republicans are corporate friendly, but the Democrats are owned by the companies, right? And Obama was no different. And I think that his base fundamentally knew this but refused to accept it, and it drove them nuts. It drove them a little bit out of their minds. There's this great story in Watership Down, which is, it's not a great novel, but it's like a novel I'm very fond of. And it has a lot of great scenes to it. And one of the great scenes is when Silver and his little band of rabbits get to this warren that's on a farmer's that's on a farmer's land, right? And the warren, it's still there intact, but all the rabbits are a little bit crazy because they don't realize. Because what happens is that, the farmer leaves this warren of rabbits on his farm and allows them to steal vegetables from his farm. Because what he does is that every night he steals one of the rabbits. He's got the snare and he catches a rabbit and he eats the rabbit every night. Okay? And so all the rabbits in the warren, they're in this, low-grade hysteria because they're eating vegetables, lettuces and what have you. But every night one of their own disappears and gets eaten, and they know it. Okay? And it creates this low-grade psychosis. They're all crazy, but it's like a low-grade kind of craziness, and that eventually will bubble up. Okay? And I think that a lot of the hysteria we're seeing in the Democratic Party now is, in a very real sense, like a product of the Obama government, the 8 years of Obama, where he kept promising his base that he was going to be a decent man, but he was fundamentally dishonest and immoral. You know what I mean? Oh, and let's not even get started with Obamacare. But you see the point I'm trying to make here.
And that's a wonderful little tease for when we do that episode.
Yeah.
Which I think there's enough meat there.
Yeah.
as we talk about it.
Yeah. So this was the episode of people that everybody think are heroes who are actually villains. I don't think anybody really lionizes Woodrow Wilson anymore, do they? I mean, apart from Princetonians.
In and of himself personally, no, but his ideology is ingrained in liberal international politics, unfortunately.
Yeah, the neoliberal.
Globalism is his baby to a certain extent.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, we're gonna call it a podcast. This is Coach Red Pill, and this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. And I bid you all a fond farewell. Dr. Benway, why don't you take us out with some final thoughts before we sign off?
I'll be enigmatic. I'll say, if you're going to read one little book out of everything we discussed, nice little book by Robert Penn Warren, you may know the name, a 150-page book called The Legacy of the Civil War, you will get a sense how psychologically that war fucked up a lot of things more than it helped a lot of things. I'll leave you with that.
Well, it's a good suggestion. And so with that, take it easy.
Take care.